What do most people misunderstand about psychedelics?
What do they least understand? Or sorry,
What do most people misunderstand about
misunderstand?
psychedelics?
Huh. Maybe what they are, and they lump too many different drugs in with psychedelics. Like it's too much of a broad church, arguably, um, which in my view means the term starts to lack precision, cover too much, and then become misleading. So, one good example might be ketamine, which in my view isn't a psychedelic. It could have psychedelic effects, but it's not a quintessential psychedelic. It's more a dissociative anesthetic. We've got evidence to show that that is its main effect, dissociation, and not, um, what psychedelic actually refers to, which is the opening up of the whole of the mind. Psychedelic means most literally soul revealing. And I don't really think that that's the main thing that ketamine does. So, you might see in the media people conflate ketamine as a psychedelic and then refer to the harms of psychedelics, and they're talking about perhaps the harms of ketamine, and then I wince a bit because I think, well, ketamine is not really a psychedelic, and you're sort of confusing the picture by lumping it in. So, yeah, um, that might be one, is that people don't really know what they're referring to when they use the term psychedelic. If you want some crisp examples, psilocybin in magic mushrooms is a classic psychedelic. LSD is arguably the prototypical psychedelic. It was after the discovery of LSD that the Western world really, at least in terms of scientific interest, really took an interest in psychedelic compounds. Mescaline would be another classic psychedelic. So yeah.
Okay. And so how would you differentiate the two? What exactly would be psychedelic versus a category of, let's say, other drugs like ketamine, MDMA, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, you could go really broad and say there are a lot of psychoactive drugs that, in a sense, get you high, and these are often drugs of potential misuse, whether they be cannabis or stimulants or alcohol or ketamine or MDMA or classic psychedelics. So it all depends where we're gonna dial in. Um, but the classic psychedelics, compounds like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, that people can take on its own if they vape it or smoke it or inject it, um, or they take it orally in combination with something else. Typically, they would do that as ayahuasca. It's used in the Amazon as a brew. Or mescaline. And so those quintessential, prototypical, canonical, if you want, classic psychedelics, um, they what they're doing subjectively, psychologically, that is definitive of them is, I would say, in a nutshell, psychological insight.
Okay.
They are revealing what I might call the hidden mind, the psyche as a whole. Um, so there, I am subscribing to the view that the mind is much more than we typically realize from the vantage or viewpoint of normal waking consciousness. We aren't aware of the entire scope of the mind or the entire depth of the mind. We assume it's sort of narrower or shallower than it really is. And that's a very convincing, compelling myth. Many people in cognitive psychology and mainstream psychology believe the mind is relatively flat or shallow. In fact, there's a pop science book called "The Mind Is Flat," and I knew I had to read it because straight away I disagreed with it. And I read it, and at the end of it, I really disagreed with it. The mind is fundamentally extremely deep. And psychedelics are special tools for revealing that. It's why it's a subtitle of the book that I'll release, I think, sometime next year. How psychedelics work, the hidden mind, illuminating the hidden mind, because psychedelics really show the true depth of the mind, the entirety of the mind, the psyche, if you want. So that's really, I would say, front and center. There is another subjective effect that goes alongside that psychological insight, and that would be the vision promoting effects of psychedelics. So I prefer to say it that way, because the subjective effects, they they don't neatly fit in with hallucinations. They're more reliably in the visual domain. They're much less reliably in the auditory domain, or olfactory, smell, sound. um, Psychedelics, they might disturb those sensory domains, but it's really the visual one that they really hack into and excite, in a sense. And so the vision promoting effects of classic psychedelics would be another quintessential aspect of their phenomenology or subjective effect profile. And if you were to say, well, what about ketamine? What about MDMA? Those two properties of psychological insight and vision promotion, I would argue, wouldn't be the main thing that those drugs do. They can do that. They can be psychedelic, but those psychedelic effects aren't front and center with those compounds. And, I'm not just saying this kind of on a whim. We have done some science on this particular question of what are the main effects of ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin as a classic psychedelic. And to summarize, for psilocybin, the classic psychedelic, the main effects were psychological insight and vision promotion. And for MDMA, it was feelings of love, pro-social feelings. And for ketamine, it was sensations of dissociation, of feeling apart from your body, disconnected from your body, if you want. So that was an interesting exercise to try and sort of highlight what's the main thing that those three different drugs do to help pass between, in a sense, near neighbor compounds, drugs that often get conflated together, in my view, unhelpfully. Yeah.
Yeah. And it makes sense, right? I mean, I think in 1970, Nixon decided to put a war on drugs with the Controlled Substance Act and put all of these drugs into one category. And are you still there?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry,
Poor
reconnecting there.
connection.
Yeah, so Nixon put together all of these drugs into one place and kind of put this war on drugs, which, I think kind of made it seem like everything was just as dangerous as one another. Is that, you think, kind of the main reason why most people, kind of associate all of these drugs into one simple category?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. It was classic, in psychology, we would call it splitting. You make something a bad object, and you project all bad stuff into these drugs. Funnily enough, Nixon, I think, liked to have a drink. So he was a drug taker. And there's massive contradiction there. But appealing to something, I would say, archetypal, that we do this thing, we project into substances that they're evil, that they're wrong, that the use of them is like sacrilegious. That goes back to, Catholicism and other activities around the world where people have projected into others, use of drugs and substances as being immoral somehow. He hacked, in a sense, into that archetypal phenomenon and our tendency to split, in politics, dumbing down, making things seem simpler than they really are is a very powerful strategy. The enemy is all bad and evil and propaganda in that direction. It's kind of how politics works and always has. And so it was a political move. It certainly, it's laughable and I'm laughing. It certainly wasn't a scientific move. It is laughable to portray drugs as a whole category or conveniently not alcohol as all bad and evil, and those who take them as like, maybe people sort of vulnerable and corrupted by evil drug pushers, But he did that. He played that game. It appealed to the moralism that is there, let's say in right wing politics in particular, closely associated perhaps with religion and Christianity, not to consciously trash or bash on any particular religion, but he did play that game, and it was very effective, and it won him voters and it won him power. And that, you could argue, was a major part of the motivation and aim with the drugs war, was just a political game to win favor, by saying, I will, wage this war on this bad thing and I'm the good guy, and so lift himself up in the eyes of the public as some kind of moral crusader. And it's such a shame because science and medicine was caught in the crossfire there. And psychedelics are lumped in as narcotics, this term that almost intrinsically implies bad. And that is such a shame, because used in certain ways, psychedelics could be life-saving medicines that could transform people's lives and turn their lives around from a path of ruin and potential, fatality through, say, hard drug use or suicide. And then, aside from the medical applications, psychedelics, as I've alluded to with trying to define them, are so powerful, maybe uniquely powerful scientific tools. The analogy of a telescope has been used before, a technology that's allowed us to see more of the universe. And then all these cascading insights about the nature of the universe because we could see further with this tool. And it's a similar thing with psychedelics. In this case, we're seeing further, deeper into our minds. We're seeing, properties and aspects of our minds that we didn't know were there otherwise. If you don't use this telescope into the mind, if you don't use this tool, you come to the conclusion that the mind is flat, and you write a book about it, and people think it's good and convincing, but it's just someone who hasn't properly appreciated that there is this very powerful scientific tool, remarkably powerful set of tools that can allow us to see, further into the true nature of the mind.
Yeah. And this idea of using psychedelics, not just for leisure, but to unlock parts of our minds and to have this relationship with it is not a modern concept, right? If you're talking about peyotes or psilocybin, we have ancestors that have used it in very, spiritual ways, Can you talk about like how far we can trace back based on research, how far back our ancestors were using psychedelics, and what was the relationship with psychedelics at that time? What were they using and how were they were using it?
Yeah, it's not my main forte, but I do know a bit about it. So I know that there's evidence of psychedelic substances having been found in archaeological artifacts, say, um, you know, drinking cups that have had trace amounts of 5-methoxy DMT, actually, a classic psychedelic, incredibly potent. Michael Pollan called it the Everest of psychedelics. I was talking to a journalist about that recently, and he said, not everyone comes back from Everest.
That's true.
Yeah.
And you need to
Um,
train for it too.
yeah, right. So yeah, but human beings, it seems, have been using psychedelics for a very long time. Certain cultures, and then people speculate that maybe this had a big impact on culture. Maybe there were, certain specific people who had that access early on, and they became the sages. Um, they became the people who knew. Yeah, and then there's the communal use. We have evidence of psilocybin magic, if you want, mushrooms having been used in Central America and Mexico for thousands of years. We can see that through some artwork, lots of depictions of mushrooms in trippy contexts, but also, yeah, the archaeological finds and actual residues of psychedelics. Um, yeah, so it goes back a long way, and then it's still there in certain cultures, say in the Amazon, mountains of Mexico, people using psilocybin mushrooms as part of syncretic r- religions, part Christianity, part something more aligned with the indigenous people there, pre-Christianity. Similar in South America, in Brazil, with ayahuasca, in other countries. Around the Amazon with ayahuasca. Um, yeah, so the short story is it goes back a long way. It's not something new. I guess what's new is the way that we're starting to really pay attention in terms of modern science and medicine. That's the new thing. But even, Western people, it can be traced. At least the psychedelic experience can be traced in a compelling way to the Mediterranean, say ancient Greece, people like Pythagoras in his cave, tripping out, having insights, sharing them, and then the cascade of people following him, Plato, using the analogy of a cave. Um, he did that famously, that we experience things like prisoners in a cave, seeing shadows on a wall, cast on a wall, and believing that that's reality, and then being freed and led out of the cave only to be stunned by the brilliance of actual reality. That was such a powerful metaphor of Plato's. Um, and whether they were tripping or not, some people think they were, the ancient Greeks. And, we had the Eleusinian Mysteries as a popular book, the Immortality Key, and others that came before that have hypothesized that a certain sacrament that was sort of the culmination of these rites in ancient Greece and then into Rome, um, contained a psychedelic substance. So they were literally tripping in ancient Greece. Um, and then many of the names that I've mentioned there partook in this initiation rite, if you want, or ceremony, um, ritual of Eleusis. Yeah. So Yeah, as I recognize, as others before me did, say Stan Groff, the psychedelic experience is something more fundamental than psychedelic drugs. Psychedelic drugs are very robust and reliable tools, potent tools for getting you to the psychedelic state, the psychedelic experience. But the psychedelic experience is more fundamental. The drugs are hijacking a natural system. We have the capacity for psychedelic states, mind opening states, seeing the true depth of the mind. We have that capacity, in a sense, regardless of psychedelic drugs, but those drugs are very, neat keys in a sense for unlocking that lock that then opens the door to the psychedelic state. So yeah, whether it's sensory deprivation in a cave, maybe some sleep deprivation, there are other ways of sort of hacking our physiology to get to that psychedelic state, um, and humans have a very deep history of doing that kind of biohacking in a sense.
Yeah, I 2 months ago I did a 3 day dark retreat in Mexico where it was completely dark, and I fasted through those 3 days as well. And within the second day, I was definitely having visual experiences I've never had before. And I researched it after, and it's because our pineal gland is so activated from the melatonin that increases from being in the dark. So it wasn't an intentional experience that I was trying to go for, but it just found it fascinating that being in the dark for that long can just spur that out.
Yeah, I'm curious. Did you have visions? Did you have any psychological insights?
A ton of psychological insights for sure. Visualizations, yeah, it was. I was seeing a. I knew I wasn't seeing anything. I knew it was completely dark, but I would start to see light around me, and I would look in one corner and I would see like sculptures, and then I would look at another corner and I would see pyramids. It was just like quite random. I didn't actually make sense of it in the end, but just yeah, it was just fascinating considering that I wasn't on anything. So it was like my
Yeah,
first time where I had that experience
yeah,
without any, psychedelics.
yeah. But in a sense, tripping on your own internal physiology, being allowed to change in a particular way and maybe open up. It's interesting to hear about the psychological insights. Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah,
fits.
yeah.
So I would say
And
you
then
had a psychedelic experience by the sounds of it.
yeah, without the actual the
Yeah,
compounds itself,
yeah,
right?
because yeah, the drug, sure, it dominates how we think of the state, but again, to the point, the state itself is the more fundamental thing. The drug
Mm,
is hacking into that natural capacity that's in us all. Anyway, that's often what drugs do. They hack into a natural capacity, like pain relieving drugs hack into our natural capacity to release natural painkillers, endorphins.
right.
Yeah, so that's what the opiates are doing, heroin and so on, fentanyl. They're just hacking into that natural capacity that's already there.
What
Yeah.
are some biohacks? I'm not sure what the nomenclature would be without using compounds, without needing to spend in the dark for 3 days, that allows us to have more of these psychedelic experiences, but
Yeah.
without taking the compound itself.
Atypical breathing is a good one, and that's used. So we have things like holotropic breath work, but there are deeper traditions of atypical, intentional atypical breathing, inducing altered states, and there's a developing science around that. Um, you're playing with oxygen levels and oxygen to carbon dioxide levels. Um, you can inhale, air with a high concentration of carbon dioxide and have a dissociative, somewhat psychedelic experience. Um, I wrote a paper a few years ago with a colleague, Ari Brower, that we entitled Pivotal Mental States. And we say that there are these different biohacks like atypical breathing, deprivation, a lot of context of deprivation, whether that's social deprivation, things like, say, silent retreat, vipassana, that means insight, meditation retreat, um, that seem to actually alter brain chemistry in a direction that is similar to what you see when you give a psychedelic drug. So psychedelic drugs are hitting the serotonin system. Classic psychedelic drugs like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, they very much hit the serotonin system. They look a lot like serotonin, and that's how they get to hack that system. They're like serotonin imposters.
Okay.
And they hack a certain aspect of it that promotes that flexibility of mind and that opening up of mind. The jargonistic term is neuroplasticity, but the more fundamental term would just be plasticity, an ability of the mind to be sensitive to influence and to change as well. So that aspect of the serotonin system, for those who are really interested, many people might know this already, it's called the serotonin 2A receptor. It's a certain protein that's heavily expressed throughout the body, but especially in the brain and especially in the cortex, the wrinkly stuff that humans have so much of, and actually especially in the cortex that is expanded disproportionately in our species, that humans have way more of than other primates, for example. It's called high level association cortex. And actually, very early on in life, in utero, if you stimulate these serotonin receptors, these proteins in that embryo, in a human embryo, you promote the growth of neurons in the cortex. So it's a protein that very early on in life promotes growth. I mean, it promotes growth throughout life, it seems, but in utero it actually promotes the growth of the key brain cells, the neurons, cortical neurons. Later in life, in adulthood, take a psychedelic, we know this from animal work at least, you promote not the cells themselves. That's very hard to do, is to actually promote neurogenesis, the growth of actual neurons, but you can promote the anatomical properties of neurons. So the branchy bits, the dendrites, they're called. So a neuron can look a lot like a tree in a sense, and at the branchy end, the top end, if you want, that's the receiving end of a neuron. And they a lot like a tree, with big branches and then little branches coming off, then leaves, um, a little a little like that. With stimulating the 2A receptor, and also we know from just giving a psychedelic, uh, we can promote what's called the arborization, which means the branchy stuff of the neurons. The receiving ends become more abundant. Um, and yeah, that's called the promotion of anatomical neuroplasticity, and psychedelics seem to do that. Um,
Is
yeah,
there a difference between the natural intake, like natural versus, I guess, synthesized is maybe one way to put it? So things that actually have come from like earth, mushrooms, peyotes, versus more of like a synthetic form, which could be LSD in this case. Is there any differences in how our body or brains react because of one's origins?
not not really. Yeah, it's a funny old thing in a sense that level, the the universe, all that is, almost sort of transcends that distinction a bit.
Mm,
natural versus synthetic, because you're down to the molecular level. So you can synthesize a lot of pure psilocybin as a powder, say. But if you were to give magic mushrooms, the key molecule that's doing the business is still psilocybin. So it's just, if you synthesize it, you've got more of that key ingredient. Whereas if you took the natural, you have that key ingredient, psilocybin, but you have a lot of organic matter that mostly isn't psychoactive in any way. So you could
mm,
argue that the pure powder, the pure stuff, is just more targeted, more precise. Um, so yeah, that distinction between natural and synthetic is somewhat lost at that low molecular level. You have big molecules like ibogaine, which has some psychedelic properties, very complex and unusual compound. I'd love to see, in a sense, in some scientific work, how it fits in relation to classic psychedelics, dissociatives, and so on. Maybe it's also part deliriant. Um, yeah, but I do think it's more psychedelic. It's more promoting of psychological insight and visions than, say, a ketamine or
mm,
even an MDMA. But ibogaine, which is found in an African shrub and has been used by West African people for many generations, it's now being looked at in science and medicine as a potential treatment for hard drug addiction in particular, maybe also brain recovery after traumatic brain injury. So it could have, very good medical applications, carry some risks in terms of cardio, heart toxicity, um, but it also carries a lot of potential benefits. But ibogaine is a natural molecule, and it's a big molecule, um, and it takes a long time to metabolize and break down. So that's one extreme of a naturally occurring molecule. We could think of LSD. It's another pretty big molecule compared to other psychedelics, synthesized, but also found throughout nature. And this is something that Albert Hoffman realized. He was the guy who discovered LSD in the late 30s. He first synthesized it, and in 43, he first took it.
mm.
Um,
How did you discover it? I'm so curious. Like, what is that first moment where you're just, I don't know if it was intentional even, or he was trying to
Well,
find
it
something?
was somewhat serendipitous because he was tasked by his boss in Switzerland, in Basel, Switzerland, to try and play with a family of drugs that might influence blood flow. They were looking for a drug that might be useful in terms of stemming bleeding in childbirth, given the high fatality rates for mothers in childbirth. So, could we stem bleeding there? And actually, some of that work created drugs that do alter the vascular system, blood vessels, and have gone on to be used as treatments for migraine, which is a vascular, um, um, illness in a sense, in terms of vessels, getting too large, and then so drugs can shrink them down. But when Hoffman was doing that work, playing with these agotamines that are derived from a fungus that grows on certain grasses, rye grass, um, one of the chemicals that he synthesized was LSD. And he said that he had this curious presentiment, this curious whim to go back and look at what we now know was LSD. And he took a little bit, and he had a little trip. And then he thought, this is interesting. So he went back the next day and took what he thought was still a very careful and cautious dose, but was 250 micrograms, which for chemists, they would know that that's a pretty small amount in terms of size, but it's actually a very large trip in terms of LSD. And so he had this like weird and wonderful and somewhat not just wonderful, but frightening, terrifying, big, the first ever, true LSD trip, and freaked out, knew or felt he had to get home, jumped on his bicycle, rode through the streets of Basel, tripping balls. Has now become immortalized in this bicycle day. People around the world recognize that, and in San Francisco they get on their bikes, actually probably drop some acid and cycle through Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. So it's this whole phenomenon, and that was the world's first ever sort of substantial LSD trip in 1943, actually April the 19th,
Wow.
1943. Yeah. So but he was looking for something else, and it often happens this way in science, that you have these sort of happy accidents and stumble across, an alternative application of a chemical, say, when looking for something else originally.
Mm.
So yeah, and there's something of sort of true, that's sort of science at its best and most beautiful, in a sense, that kind of pure discovery and major like surprise and awe that you're finding something that you just really didn't expect at all. And then it didn't take long for Hoffman and his colleagues to think, oh, we've got something here. This could have a big impact in psychiatry. And that takes us into the 1950s, and the research with LSD and other psychedelics like psilocybin in the 1950s, and the developing realization that these could be especially useful tools to facilitate psychotherapy, especially
Mm.
deep psychotherapy, what we might call depth psychotherapy, like psychoanalysis, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud and that style of psychotherapy. Um, yeah, and that's kind of actually that line of thinking, that topic is what drew me in. I was studying psychoanalysis and then realized that psychedelics were used for that purpose in the 1950s. And then, yeah, that was a major light bulb moment for me that drew me in. Yeah.
And you've done these studies now. There was a period of time where there weren't studies being done to study the effects of LSD legally on human volunteers. What did you
Mm.
learn?
Mm. Well, we did a series of fMRI brain imaging studies, and we used other technologies looking at brain waves, MEG, and EG, looking at brain waves. And so we've learned that the brain is organized in a particular way to constrain our experience of the world and hold it steady, and regular. We tend to just catch the gist of things, like just enough to maintain a sort of steady flowing quality to our consciousness. Like how I'm talking, I'm not thinking about the granularity, I'm not really thinking about the different noises that are being generated by my body. But I'm thinking you can probably understand, and hopefully the audience too. People can catch the gist, and there's like this knowing level, quite high level of comprehension, um, where we're not caring about the little granular bits. And that's how, that's the water that we swim in, as fish that don't realize that we're fish in water, so to speak. Um, that is how it's all working. But psychedelics, they hit that and break it down. And when we look in the brain, we can see, in a sense, the kind of physical substrates of that breaking down. So we see these networks that are ordinarily pretty well organized. They have certain regularities in their activity, in how different regions that make up these networks talk to each other with a certain degree of coherence. And that coherence breaks down. So that's part of the picture. There is a functional disintegration or breakdown of order that we see. We can see that with fMRI in terms of brain networks becoming less strongly interconnected, less internally integrous, if you want. Just a neater and fine way to put it is that the networks disintegrate, show some degree of disintegration or breakdown. We can also look at how brain networks talk to each other. Ordinarily, there's a degree of there's like boundaries between networks, so that the functions that those networks do, like seeing, like vision, or moving your body, those functions don't get confused. There's a degree of sort of functional segregation, and that segregation breaks down too. So there's a certain disintegration, but also a desegregation in the brain. So to that second point, that second property, it's like the networks open up, their profile or scope of communication broadens. And that's like, if we go back to how I was describing normal waking consciousness, how we catch the gist, we don't care about the granularity. Um, that way of being structured and organized breaks down so that it's harder to catch the gist. The gist becomes more fluid. And actually, we start to notice some of the granularity that ordinarily would be just smoothed out of conscious experience. Some of that granularity might be the visions, seeing things that ordinarily you just wouldn't see. Where are those visions coming from? I think they're coming from the mind and brain. I think they're ordinarily latent. They're suppressed. They're not excited into manifest or expressed form, but they're there. They're there, stored away, albeit dormant. We also there's a more overarching principle that I'm describing here that I refer to as the entropic brain, and entropy is it could be thought of as disorder, a system or a thing's level of order versus disorder. In the universe, there is a tendency for things to naturally flow towards greater disorder. Another way to say it is for things to flow to a more spread out steady state, a more balanced, spread out steady state, rather than all being, structured and organized in a particular way. Think of like shuffling a deck of cards, when they're all ordered to begin with, you shuffle them, you're going to, randomize things and create disorder. And the universe tends to go that way. It's called the second law of the thermodynamics. It's what, describes how ice cubes melt and, puff of smoke disperses and diffuses. Yeah, the entropic brain's a little like that. It's as if the mind and brain is moving towards greater spread outness, less order, more disorder. And that correlates with a sense of a breakdown of order and structure, but also a sense of conscious experience becoming richer, more content full, in line with that principle again of not, reducing conscious experience down to just the gist of things, that steady flow of just the gist of things, but actually noticing and picking up on some of the granularity, more of the dynamics, more of the sort of slippery changes. Um, and that's quite a reliable association, as brain entropy or disorder, randomness, if you want, goes up. So does our subjective sense of consciousness enriching. That goes up. And these things go hand in hand very closely, actually. Psychedelics dial up brain entropy and dial up the richness of conscious experience. Other drugs like anesthetics or sedatives, they do the opposite. They, in a big dose, they send you to sleep and they send brain entropy right down. Brain entropy becomes very steady and regular and predictable.
Are there studies done directly comparing the effects of SSRI versus psychedelics on its impact on depression and measuring things like remission rates over time to
Yeah.
compare the two?
Yes, we did a trial that did just that. We gave people with depression uh, either 2 doses of psilocybin 3 weeks apart, two big doses.
Is it
Um,
a psilocybin, you said? Okay.
yeah, or 6 weeks of an SSRI called escitalopram, otherwise known as Lexapro. It's a Prozac-like SSRI, a kind of typical conventional antidepressant drug. Um, in one of the groups, one of two groups, people took that every day for 6 weeks. So it was like a coin flip. They either get 2 doses of psilocybin 3 weeks apart, or it worked out to 42 doses of the SSRI every day for the same duration. In total, a 6 week trial. And then you compare how people change from baseline before you give them anything to that 6 week time point at the end of having received either an SSRI or 2 doses of psilocybin. So we compared outcomes in that study, before and after, and found that on virtually every outcome, I think it was 90 or 95% of outcomes. What are outcomes? They're measures. Measures of what? Well, measures of depression. We had 4 measures of depression. We had measures of anxiety, a couple of measures of well-being, um, measures of work and social functioning, a bunch of stuff.
Was this
So
qualitative from the people that have taken it, where they're being surveyed?
it's quantitative. So they are surveyed, but the data is a number. So it's
Yeah.
quantitative. So, it might range from 0 to 60, say, with
Hmm.
60 being really severe depression, 0 being no depression whatsoever. Um, So yeah, we do assess it through these subjective rating scales. Sometimes they're completed by the patients themselves. Sometimes they're completed by clinicians, doctors that look at the individual, ask a few questions, and then create the number themselves. So it's quantitative, but subjective.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we had a bunch of these measures, maybe 15 or so, and on virtually every measure, to a high degree of confidence, psilocybin was the superior treatment.
Wow.
If we looked at things like response, which is a halving of your depression score from baseline to the end of the trial, or remission, which is having a number on one of these depression rating scales that's so low that you say this person doesn't have depression anymore. That's remission. If we looked at those, we would see on some of these measures psilocybin being, in one case, 5 times better um, than the SSRI. Yeah, I mean, it was even on the main measure, that we chose ahead of the trial to be the one that would be the key one to assess differences on, remission rates were twice as high with
Mm.
psilocybin versus the SSRI. So it looked really good. It looked really positive, but there's a Murphy's Law phenomenon to describe for you here, which is that when you do a trial, it's very good practice, standard practice to choose one measure to say this is the one that definitively will decide, the world can decide, whether there is a significant difference between these treatments. So we chose that measure, and it turned out to be the least sensitive measure. It was the only measure, and analyzed in a particular way, looking at the averages and variance, that didn't significantly separate in favor of psilocybin. So when we submitted the results to the journal, which was the New England Journal of Medicine, the top medical journal, they accepted it, but they very much ran with the headline of no difference between these treatments. And so it was a sort of bittersweet experience, because we were delighted to get the paper published in the top journal, but we're a little uncomfortable with that dominant narrative of there's no difference here, because as
Mm.
I've explained to you, virtually every measure, separated in favor of psilocybin with a very high degree of confidence.
Sorry, you said no difference in terms of the overall impact of what it did to someone's depression, or are you saying no overall difference between the SSRI effects to the psychedelic effect, meaning it's equivalent?
Yeah, well, in a sense, both. I'm not clear on the difference there, but both treatments dropped depression scores.
Equally.
Well, on one of the measures, the degree, not equally, because psilocybin had dropped it more,
More, yeah.
but it hadn't quite reached a threshold where the world is, and the scientific community, more generally, sort of the world, can infer or interpret the result as really trustworthy. Um, so psilocybin hadn't quite crossed that threshold on one of the measures analyzed in a particular way. So, in science, we talk about these false positives and false negatives. False positive is where you infer that there's a difference, and there isn't really. It's like a fluke.
Yeah.
But a false negative is where you say, oh, there's no difference, but there actually is. It's just maybe your measure is not sensitive enough to pick it up, or it's a fluke in the direction of it suggesting that there's no difference. I think this was a false negative. And I think what's dominated the reporting of this trial is a false negative. And actually, we can trust that, at least according in this trial and these data, psilocybin was the superior treatment, improving depression scores to a significant extent, significantly greater extent than the SSRI,
Yeah.
and improving. I mean, this came through without any equivocation or ambiguity, on measures like well-being and work and social functioning, on a sense of connectedness, a sense of meaning in life. All of those measures, without any ambiguity, superior with psilocybin, not just at 6 weeks, but as long as 6 months when we measured again, favoring psilocybin. So that's not a small thing. It says to people, if you have depression, of these two treatments, if you want to think about how you'll be feeling and doing in 6 months' time, you might choose the psilocybin, because your work and social functioning is going to be significantly better. You're going to
Yeah.
feel more connected to yourself, to other people, to the world. You have a deeper sense of meaning in life, and you'll have a generally better sense of well-being. So there, it looks like a no-brainer in a sense, as to
What do you
which.
think is the hesitation then? Because you're saying even if there's no difference between the SSRIs and psychedelics, the reality for what you've shown is that it's very effective.
Yeah.
So when it comes to clinicians and psychiatrists, what do you think is the holdup in terms of providing at least both options and being trained to do that um, from a mainstream perspective?
I think it's that the mainstream is a heavy system. It's like deep establishment systems and infrastructure take time to shift. You know, they have deep roots and deep traditions, and deep and strong assumptions are tied up with the current system. There's a lot of training and you know, principles, myths or way of looking at things that are very strong with the status quo, with the dominant system. Um, and that's what we're up against. That we're up against sort of convention and conventional thinking and the deep infrastructure that, like a positive feedback loop that reinforces that current system. So to change that requires, and to change it so radically as psychedelic therapy, in a sense, threatens to do, can be very threatening. Um, and it ain't going to shift too easily. The regulators, the people that could allow such a change are going to be very scrutinizing of the results and the data. They're going to be very conscious of any potential bias, things like confirmation bias. They might come at things influenced by stigma as well, especially in the context of psychedelics, with the rich associations from the 60s, left over from the drugs war and so on, that these are narcotics, these are drugs of abuse, they're dangerous. So all of that influences assumptions, whether consciously or otherwise. And that's part of what we're up against. I would love to be an idealist here and say that science will win out, evidence will win out, and the evidence will, in time, prove to be too compelling to ignore and will force a change in the system. And I do believe that that's coming. I don't think it will be an easy process. It hasn't proved to be an easy process so far. Um,
Yeah.
but I
Well,
think
as
that's
a regulator, I'd be thinking, okay, what are the downsides of both options? So obviously, anything you overconsume, literally anything, is going to have some sort of harm. And the same thing could be said for psychedelics as well. But if we were to control both usages with a clinician, what are the downsides for taking SSRI, either short term or long term, and same with psychedelics for the purpose of treating depression here, let's say?
Yeah, so starting with the SSRI, there's a bunch of side effects. There are things like emotional blunting or numbing, pretty well characterized now with SSRIs. For some people, that's welcome. That's like taking the edge off their depression and their stress, helping them get by. Some people have it worse than others. Um, the sexual dysfunction, very, very common with SSRIs. People can't orgasm and so on. Um, uh, and then there's some gastrointestinal stuff as well with SSRIs, and sometimes some sleep issues, sometimes some restlessness and agitation as well, particularly in young people. And then there might be some subtle changes in terms of sort of character drift. There was one study that found sort of muted empathy in people on SSRIs. So it's difficult to know how they subtly alter someone's personality and responsivity. Um, so that's the SSRI. Shifting over to the, and just taking a drug every day. You got to remember to, you got to want to, you got to think it's worth it over and above the side effects, and if you're on it, is it changing you in a way that might make it difficult to come off it? A little bit like if you were drug dependent on a rewarding drug, like alcohol or heroin or something. Then over to the psychedelic, its side effects, most obvious side effects would be the disorientation and the altered state, putting you in danger when you're under its influence. So very sadly and tragically, there have been tragedies, many, when people have been tripping, out in the world, say in an urban environment, getting hit by traffic, being up at height, jumping or falling from a height. So accidents in the altered state is arguably the greatest risk, I would say. And among young people who don't understand psychedelics, who might take them in somewhere, like an urban context or even at a music festival and then be overwhelmed by that. That's the greatest danger. Then in the context of clinical work, it changes because you're looking after someone's bodily safety. So they shouldn't come to any physical harm because you're containing them in a safe space. So that massively reduces the risk of accidents. That's not a small consideration. It's really the major consideration when it comes to psychedelics and tripping. It's like have a sober sitter, and in the context of medical work, have a mental health professional, someone trained who is looking after your physical and mental well-being in that environment. So we do things like people listen to music, and we provide psychotherapeutic support before and after the trip as well for a certain period of time. But back to the risks, the trip itself can be unpleasant, can be distressing, can be terrifying. Even in conditions that are supportive, people can, in a sense, go to a hell-like realm, have difficult memories come up, terrifying visions. It can be very extreme, very distressing, confusing, and unpleasant. I wouldn't say that that's the rule. Neither, though, would I say it's the exception. It can sort of go either way. And within a trip, it can be both heaven and hell. It can be blissful and beautiful and, transcendent in a positive way.
The same trip, right? So you would
Within the
have
same
ups and
trip,
downs.
and actually early on it's more commonly unpleasant, and then later on it's more commonly pleasant. It's a bit like a hero's journey. You set out and go on an adventure and go through some ordeals only to overcome them and come back, rewarded and triumphant. It's a little like that, the arc. So, the psychedelic experience, for it to be medicinally beneficial and safe enough, has to be supported and curated in this way. But the risks are, tripping out of context, and that would cover, say, bodily injury through not being supervised, but also, mental agitation and setback if not psychologically supported before, during and after. That's where the greatest risks are with psychedelics.
You mentioned SSRI in terms of potential dependency for people that have taken it. Is the same not the case for psychedelics in terms of how someone could be dependent on taking psilocybin or LSD?
Not so obviously, and also I would walk back that SSRIs promote dependency. I did hear someone say once that the SSRI was their most reliable relationship ever.
After
like
ChatGPT, right?
This one sticks around. This one's not going to leave me. It's kind of sad, but yeah. So there is that kind of dependency, but it's not like people are craving the drug in the way that they might alcohol, for example, or a cigarette.
Sure.
With psychedelics, they also don't crave psychedelics. If it's a big magic mushroom trip, for example, most people afterwards would say, I don't really want to do that again in a hurry. I remember that it was difficult and it's weird, and I feel like I benefited, but not again anytime soon, please. So, animals don't self administer psychedelics. Little mice in cages won't push a lever to get some LSD. If anything, these drugs seem to be fundamentally aversive rather than rewarding. So they're not like most drugs of potential abuse in that sense.
Yeah.
Most drugs make you feel good. Psychedelics make you feel weird. Um, so not really. The reason why I don't want to be too absolutist there is that microdosing, the regular use of very low doses of psychedelics, is something that might, to an outsider, look like a degree of dependency. I don't think it is, because I don't hear of any craving around that at all. People are quite ready and willing to just let it go when they've sort of had enough with it. Um, and the other thought is ayahuasca retreats. Some people seem to hit those pretty hard. Uh,
Yeah, I've known some people with that.
yeah, and things can go awry in that sense. And you wonder what's going on. Are they over reliant, or, yeah, that maybe they're somewhat abusing that option, and maybe not doing it in the wisest way. I'm not sure I'd call it addiction, but maybe you could in a very, very broad sense.
I've
Um,
heard with ayahuasca, it's not just about the the drug itself, but it's also the whole community that comes with that
yeah,
that pulls you in, that tells you to come back. It's
yeah,
this other experience with it, not just
yeah.
the drug.
And actually, in certain contexts, it's also religious. It's like a sacrament. So people are, in a sense, feeling like they need to go to church somewhat regularly. Um, yeah, so it's a more complex phenomenon. If there's some regular use and maybe overuse, I would say the pull there is quite abstract relative to how you might think of it with, say, the pull towards an emotional escape or avoidance through alcohol or a sedative drug, um, or the need to be sort of normalized through getting a stimulant, because otherwise you're too depressed and low and down. So you get the stimulant to kind of wake you up and normalize you.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's a different kind of phenomenon, and it doesn't easily and neatly fit a profile of addiction or dependency with psychedelics.
Do you think there's certain personalities or characteristics profiles of people that might be better fit for a psychedelic path versus a SSRI path? Like I think about friends of mine that are generally high anxiety, and if they were to smoke or if they were to do something like psilocybin, it triggers that part of themselves and it actually amplifies their anxiety even more. It amplifies their paranoia even more.
Hmm.
And it's to the point where it's just too much for them. Versus
Yeah,
people that I know have very positive experiences. So
yeah,
in some ways, I feel like it does amplify some of the things that the characteristics that you already have.
mm,
And I'm wondering if because everybody is different, everybody has different experiences and personality traits. Are some people better fit for psychedelics versus SSRIs?
yeah. I think so. SSRIs and psychedelics, they're, in a sense, each to their own. I mean, people should, I believe, have the freedom to choose. And some people, maybe given a certain life situation, a lot of instability and turmoil, high stress, they do want a chemical assistance, in a sense, through taking an SSRI to help them get by, help them get through that very, very difficult period. And to deny them that would feel questionable. For psychedelics, just focusing on psychedelics rather than psychedelics versus SSRIs, I would say it's pretty clear that there are personality traits that interact with the psychedelic experience in positive or negative ways. And the one aspect that is front of mind for me at the moment, we have various bits of evidence to support this, is that people with a personality structure that is fragile, that is perhaps unstable, emotionally volatile. Relationships are, hard to maintain. They're often of a volatile nature. Um, these people with that, complex and somewhat unstable personality structures are those who are especially vulnerable to negative outcomes with psychedelics. They might have especially confusing and difficult trips, but more importantly, they could also be destabilized further afterwards.
I mean,
That character profile that I'm describing um, might sound to people who know psychiatry as something called personality disorder or borderline personality disorder or emotionally unstable personality disorder. It is a character profile um, of instability relationally, emotionally, and that it seems to me that that is a problematic fit for psychedelics generally. There might be a way to do it that is very psychotherapy heavy, that uses low doses, maybe uses something other than a classic psychedelic, at least initially. But to me, it just seems complicated and risky in such individuals. They might be especially sensitive to the way the psychedelic is given. Like the set and setting, the context has to be really good, really supportive for such individuals. But I don't think people can expect the trajectory to be simple and easy with such people. So
yeah.
I am shining a spotlight there in people with such a personality structure. It's also worth knowing that the borderline personality disorder, what is the border? What is that borderline? It's in reference to psychotic disorder, disorders like schizophrenia. It's saying that they're trending in the direction of something like a psychotic disorder. And again, it seems a complicated and probably just a bad fit to try and treat people with psychotic disorders and treat them with psychedelics. In the trials that we do, we exclude people with histories, both personal and family histories of psychotic illness. And now increasingly, we're also excluding people with borderline personality disorder or suspected borderline personality disorder. Yeah.
You mentioned microdosing there, and this has become more of a trend, particularly for high performance entrepreneurs, creatives. Where do you stand on microdosing for just general mood and cognition today? And what are the pros and cons of a single high dose, which seems to be what we're mostly talking about, versus the continuous multiple smaller doses, which is microdosing?
Yeah, there's a kind of culture clash here because, in the scientific community and in scientific literature, microdosing looks to have, weak and little evidence. The results tend to suggest that most of the positive effect could be explained by expectancy, um, the psychological phenomenon or thing that carries the so-called placebo response, getting better on a sugar pill, something that's not active. So it seems in the scientific literature to have a weak evidence base, and yet outside of the scientific world and literature, lots of people are microdosing and lots
Yeah.
of people are enthusiastic about it. Sorts of magazine articles and often gets talked about. So what is that? Is everyone fooling themselves, or actually maybe it does help people, and the science just hasn't captured it yet. It's a tricky one. If you're asking my informal opinion, I suspect it might be that latter scenario, that actually microdosing can be beneficial. Um, and the scientific trials haven't been designed sufficiently well yet to pick up on
Mm.
it. It's really hard to do a trial of microdosing. Um, few people have managed to get ethics or IRB approval for patients in a trial to take their microdoses home with them. And if you're having to take a drug, every other day for X number of weeks, it's very expensive and difficult to have them come into a clinic to do that. So
Yeah.
you need them to be able to do it at home. And that's hard science to do. The practical challenges of doing trials like that are just really difficult. And so I think that's hasn't helped. The literature and evidence base for microdosing is just a challenge of doing good trials. I also think that microdosing probably synergizes to some extent, combines with context, like bigger doses are thought to, the way we curate the experience with music and a lot of psychological support. I think when it comes to microdosing, people think they can bypass all of that. And I'm just not sure that they can actually. And there's other complications out in the real world where it's very easy for a microdose to become something other than a microdose, and all of a sudden someone's tripping and they've got to pick their kids up at 3 p.m. or whatever and drive the car, and so there's just awkward scenarios like that. I say awkward, that could actually become quite serious. So yeah, it's a complicated on microdosing, and we're not there yet in terms of having a compelling case for it. And people will hear that and say, "Oh, but it's changed my life." I'm much more present now, and I hear all of that. It's just, I guess the science needs to catch up and really test that. Um, yeah. So
Yeah. So just the difficulty from a clinical study, which I understand, to bring people in all the time and to measure for something like that in the long run. Yeah, it is tricky probably to do. So it could just be the limitations of the study instead of because I do hear anecdotes as well. I haven't done it personally, but I just know people that swear by it. So it's really interesting
yeah,
that there hasn't been the studies to back that up yet.
yeah. I would say I've also heard anecdotes of it not helping actually, and people dropped it because they were feeling a bit anxious, a little agitated here and there, a little confused. They thought it was going to help with their creativity and their work, and actually they found that they were just tripping and they couldn't do their work. So there's a lot of subtlety around dosing, I
Yeah.
think. And then if the dose is low, is it actually placebo that's improving you? So there are some genuine questions around it yet. I don't, when you start thinking science only needs to demonstrate something that we already know, I think that it isn't really the best use of science. Science works best when you're not really sure and you test, and you'll be guided by what you find. You have to sort of walk back your assumptions and come at it with a sort of beginner's mind, a naivety, and that way you discover more. So I would genuinely say there's reasons to continue looking at microdosing, but also just to be careful of our assumptions when we come in and do that.
Are you familiar with Brian Johnson, the blueprint guy that
Yeah,
wants to live forever? He
yeah, not super
recently,
familiar.
yeah, he's what?
I'm intrigued by the guy, but I don't know much about him.
Yeah, I mean, I follow him just because he's putting out all this information out, and you always wonder like what he's gonna try out next. And he came up with this. He quoted this published study around ketamine, and it was done in 2024. I think about 20 people who had PTSD. And one of the interesting things that they found was that there was, it actually made them younger in terms of their epigenetic clocks over 2 to 3 weeks of infusion. And obviously also, which is what their expected outcome was, reduction in depression and PTSD. Are there any studies around psychedelics and potential benefits of longevity? Because I could see the indirect benefits, right? Maybe not directly, but the indirect impacts of things like abstinence from smoking or alcohol. I think there are some studies around that. Or removing depression could potentially make you sleep better and deeper. And that will obviously have an indirect impact on your health, a big one. Yeah. But are there any measured studies around, hey, if you take psilocybin or whatnot, there are things that we can measure, like this study, this study in 2024 for ketamine around age? And or do you think even the study itself for ketamine, do you think that's more noise than signal?
I need to look at it. I don't know the details of that particular study. I did read a paper recently. In fact, it's not far away from me. I have it in my office now, where they treated mice with psilocybin and found that certain aspects of cell health were improved by that treatment in the direction of improved longevity. And I also think the mice lived longer, if I remember correctly. And I think Brian Johnson also jumped on that result to say maybe magic mushrooms help you live longer. It's tricky because it's feeding into another myth, like Richard Nixon hijacked an archetype and a myth around evil drug use. Brian Johnson's tapping into an archetype around the elixir vital. Is that right? The elixir of life. The idea that there's some secret magic potion that lets us live forever or lives longer. So it is a powerful archetype that you can find, throughout history. People playing on that idea that we just need to find this fountain of youth and bathe in it and we'll live forever. I think the Spanish conquistadors thought that way and thought they would find it. It's a very powerful and seductive myth, but I think it's a myth. It appeals to something we want. I don't know, maybe science could get us there. Science has improved longevity quite considerably over the last 200 years or so. It's one of the, things that are most held up in terms of what science can do and its power. A lot of that, I think, was actually just sanitation, though, and infrastructure, clean water.
Yeah.
I'll keep watching. Neuroplasticity, that's something that feeds into the same archetype, the idea of health and life promoting drug effects, replenishing the branchy bits of neurons that are actually very reliably atrophied in mental illness and in relation to stress. So it's a beautiful and very appealing and seductive idea. I say myth, when I use that term, I use it to mean story, narrative, not in the more colloquial sense of it meaning a lie.
Because it hasn't been proven yet through the clinical studies of science.
Hasn't been proven yet. So it's a story.
By humans, at least.
It's a narrative. Yeah. It's a promise. I think Brian Johnson seems to do that a lot, this sort of promissory messaging. It's not what a scientist should do. We tend to wear the hat of skepticism and approach that way. Open-minded skepticism is a good way to go about things. You can overshoot with too much skepticism. You can also overshoot with too much open-mindedness. So it's
sure.
It's key to get the balance right there.
I mean, you can kind of see where it could lead to increasing longevity, right? If we're saying all of these things, that depression can kill someone faster, if if you have like a purpose, you're not sleeping well, you have high anxiety, all these things lead to, poor quality sleep. So in an indirect way, I could see having something like psychedelics could having some sort of effect. It just, as you said, it is a myth until you prove it through science before you
I,
can
I
recommend it.
Yeah, I think that's the more compelling angle here. Is indirectly it could promote health and thereby, well, directly it could promote health, I think, and thereby promote longevity through less stress.
Yeah, makes
Yeah,
sense.
and better, healthful lifestyles, healthful behaviors. So there, I actually think a compelling case could be made. Um, Whether it actually like taps into a de-aging mechanism, I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Well, we spoke about a lot of different pathways here, from the history all the way to what psychedelics can and cannot do. If listeners here today, if they're curious about psychedelics, maybe if it's something that they've already consumed before, what's one idea from this conversation that you want someone to take away, and what's something that they should forget, something that's not as relevant?
I'm not sure there's anything for them to forget as such. Maybe question, some assumptions that they might have had previously. Um, a key principle to be very aware of is the context. I wrote a paper a few years ago on the essential importance of context in psychedelic therapy. It's not a new message; it's an old one, but it's. I do think it's one to repeat over and over, which is that these are very, very powerful tools, um, tools that could do great good and be very beneficial to people, but that very same power um, underwrites their potential for harm too. And so the context seems to be essentially important. So, if you're someone who wants to take matters into their own hands, I mean, there are legal ways to get psychedelic therapy now in Oregon. I'm wearing the T-shirt. I supported that campaign that's now providing legal um, adult supervised psilocybin services in the state of Oregon. Colorado have something similar, if not broader, in terms of access to legal psilocybin therapy, and soon other compounds too, provided in that regulated, supervised way. Other states are likely to follow, and federally, we might see psilocybin therapy approved for depression, probably 2027, if not late next year. Maybe MDMA therapy for PTSD and veterans could be approved sometime next year. So these big changes are coming, but when they come in regulated systems, they're all coming with that condition of it being supervised, that it being professionally provided and supervised. And young people or people just naive to this topic, please don't come in thinking that these really are magic cures and they just need to get the magic drug to live forever and happily ever after. That is a myth, and there's much more nuance and subtlety to it, and the main nuance to be aware of is that essential importance of context.
Perfect. Well, thank you for breaking down that for us, Robin. I want to make sure people get your upcoming book as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be, I'm sure at some point someone's going to listen to this and the book will be out, but it's called How Psychedelics Work, Illuminating the Hidden Mind.
That's right.
Where can people find out more about you and get notifications when the book comes out?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my website is the sort of funnel point in a sense, carhartharrislab.com, Carhart-Harris Labs, all one word.com. And there they can subscribe on the landing page to pre-order the book and also get our monthly, it's more like 5 weekly, to be honest, newsletter. But I do that, I give it a bit of time and quite enjoy doing it. I do a little reading from the book. So hopefully people listening will be interested enough to subscribe and get that newsletter and get the information about the book and when it's coming out.
Perfect. We'll have that link down below. Robin, appreciate you. Thanks for coming on.
You too, Sean. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.